The thing about holding your newborn children for the first time is that nothing else exists. Not the pain, and the pain was considerable. The kind that makes you understand why the word agony exists as a separate category from the word hurt. Not the fear that had been building for 6 months about whether I was going to be strong enough for what was coming. Not the email that had arrived on my phone at 8:47 that morning, while they were wheeling me into the operating room with a subject line that read executed, and a dollar amount that I had been working toward for 8 years, and that I had not yet had time to fully process, because the twins were in distress, and the doctors were moving fast, and the only thing in the world that mattered in that moment was getting my children safely into it. Not any of it. When they placed Micah on my chest, and then Aisha beside him, when I felt the specific, impossible weight of two people who had not existed outside of my body until that moment, everything else became noise. Necessary noise, but noise. My name is Dr. Simone Hayes. I was 37 years old when my husband served me divorce papers in my hospital recovery room 15 minutes after I gave birth to our twins. I was still bleeding beneath the hospital gown. My hands were shaking so badly from the after effects of surgery that I could barely hold both babies at once. The IV was still in my arm, and my husband, Christopher Hayes, walked through the door in a suit that probably cost $4,000, with a woman I had met twice at his company events standing behind him, wearing ivory, like she had dressed for something she intended to celebrate. He placed an envelope on the rolling tray beside my hospital bed, next to the cup of ice chips the nurse had brought me, and he said, "This marriage is finished. Sign the papers, and we can both move forward with our lives." What Christopher did not know, what the woman standing behind him did not know, what no one in that recovery room knew except me and my attorney and the legal team at Vertex Biopharmaceuticals, was that 6 hours and 14 minutes before Christopher filed those divorce papers downtown, I had executed a licensing agreement that I had spent 8 years building in the basement laboratory of the house Christopher owned, using equipment I had purchased with money Christopher did not know I had, developing a gene editing protocol that could cure the disease that had killed my brother Marcus when he was 11 years old and I was 19. And the grief of it had reorganized every ambition I had ever had into a single, driving, relentless purpose. The licensing agreement was valued at $1.2 billion. And buried in the prenuptial agreement Christopher had signed 8 years ago, the one his father had insisted on to protect the Hayes family assets, the one Christopher had bragged about at our rehearsal dinner, the one he had never read past the signature page because he had been too confident to believe he needed to, was a clause that an attorney named Dr. Patricia Oduya, my late research mentor, had helped me write when I was 29 years old and newly engaged, and not yet certain what I was preparing for, but certain enough to prepare. The clause stated that any intellectual property developed by either party during the marriage remained the sole property of its creator, and it contained a penalty provision. If either spouse filed for divorce within 60 days of the other spouse executing a major financial contract, the filing spouse forfeited 40% of their personal net worth as liquidated damages. Christopher had filed today, exactly 6 hours and 14 minutes after the 60-day clock began. He stood in my recovery room with his mistress behind him and his lawyer already on the phone downtown, completely certain that he was standing over the ruins of my life. He had no idea he was standing in the opening chapter of his own undoing, and I looked at my babies, Micah with his father's nose, Aisha with her great-grandmother's forehead, and I held them tighter, and I did not cry, and I did not sign. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We love seeing this community show up from every corner of this country and beyond. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos, because this story is just beginning. Stay with me all the way to the end. Now, let me take you back to where it actually started. Not the hospital, the beginning, which is a kitchen in Detroit in 1993, and a little boy named Marcus, who was afraid of the dark and slept with a nightlight and had a laugh that you could hear from the next block over. My brother Marcus was born with sickle cell disease. I did not fully understand what this meant when I was young. I understood that he got sick sometimes in ways that required hospital visits, that there were medications and protocols, and a specific vigilance my mother maintained around his diet and his exertion levels, and the temperature of the rooms he slept in. I understood that the crisis episodes were painful for him in a way that was difficult to watch and impossible to fully comprehend from the outside. But I did not understand, not with the depth that reorganizes a life around it, what sickle cell actually was until I was 15 and Marcus was 7. And he had a crisis severe enough to keep him in the hospital for 11 days, and I sat beside his bed during every visiting hour and read to him from a library book about how the blood worked, how the cells that were supposed to be smooth and flexible were instead rigid and misshapen, how they stuck in the blood vessels and starved the tissues of oxygen, how the pain of a sickle cell crisis was one of the most severe forms of acute pain that human medicine had documented. I read it and I understood it, and something shifted in me that I have never been able to shift back. I was 15 years old, and I decided that I was going to fix it, not someday. Not if I got into the right school, or landed the right research position, or found the right funding. I was going to fix it the way you decide to do something, when the reason is not ambition, but love, and love does not negotiate with obstacles. It simply continues. Marcus died when I was 19 and he was 11. It was November, the year I was in my first semester of university on a full academic scholarship that I had worked for with the specific focus of a person who knows exactly why they need the education they are pursuing. The crisis came fast, and complications arose, and the treatment options had limits that his small body reached before the medicine could. I flew home and I sat with him and I held his hand and I talked to him about everything I was going to do, the research I was going to conduct, the papers I was going to publish, the protocol I was going to develop that would mean no other family would sit in this room, in this particular grief, ever again. He died on a Tuesday morning with my mother on one side and me on the other, and the November Detroit light coming through the window the way it does in that city, in that month, flat and cold and completely indifferent. I went back to school the following week, not because I was not devastated. I was. I went back because the work was the only form of love that still had somewhere to go. I was a good student in the way that some people are good at things because they care, rather than because they are naturally talented, which produces a different kind of competence, harder to develop, but more durable once developed. I cared about molecular biology with the specific caring of someone who has a name and a face attached to the problem they are trying to solve. I cared about gene editing with the particular attention of a person who has visited the damage of a genetic mutation in human form and understands that the distance between the laboratory bench and the outcome it might produce is not abstract. It is measured in people. I completed my doctorate at Northwestern. I published in 3 major journals before I was 28. I established Mitchell Biosolutions LLC using my maiden name, not because I was planning anything specific at that time, but because my mentor, Dr. Patricia Oduya, had told me, with the flat authority of someone who had watched too many women's professional work become entangled in their personal relationships, to always maintain a professional identity that was entirely yours. I registered the LLC in Delaware at 23 years old. I set up a separate bank account. I continued building toward a protocol that I believed was achievable within a decade if the work was focused and the funding was managed correctly. Then I met Christopher Hayes at a medical conference in Boston when I was 29, and for 2 years, the work and the life coexisted without conflict. And then they married, and the conflict began so gradually, I almost did not notice it arriving. Christopher Hayes was 41 years old when we met, 12 years older than me, the second son of one of Chicago's most established families, the kind of man whose biography is summarized in 3 words: old money, impeccable connections, absolute certainty about his own importance and who had developed, through decades of having that certainty confirmed by the world around him, a quality that is sometimes mistaken for confidence and is actually closer to the complete inability to imagine being wrong. He was genuinely charming. I want to be honest about this because the version of this story that turns Christopher into a villain from the first scene is not the true version and not the useful one. He was charming and intelligent and had the specific quality of a man who, when he chose to pay full attention to a person, made them feel completely seen. He paid full attention to me for the first 2 years of our relationship. He asked about the research with what appeared to be genuine interest. He came to the laboratory once, early in our relationship, and spent 2 hours asking questions and seemed genuinely engaged with what I was trying to do. He told me, on more than one occasion, that my mind was the thing about me that had first arrested his attention. I believed him. I loved him. For the first 3 years of our marriage, I loved him with the specific quality of someone who has found the thing they did not know they were looking for and is grateful for the surprise of it. The erosion began so gradually that I have spent years trying to identify the moment it started, and I have concluded that it did not have a moment. It had a direction. The direction was set by his mother, a woman named Eleanor Hayes, who had spent 60 years believing that the appropriate role of a wife in a family like the Hayes family was to be an ornament and an administrator to manage the household, to attend the events, to reflect well on the family name, to be accomplished enough to be interesting in conversation, and deferential enough to never actually challenge anyone's authority. Eleanor had done this herself for 40 years and believed it was the correct path, and communicated that belief to Christopher in ways so consistent and so embedded that he had absorbed it without ever examining it. When I was publishing and presenting and building toward the protocol in the basement laboratory he had been initially enthusiastic about, I was interesting to him. When I was successful in ways that required him to adjust his understanding of the relative professional standing in the marriage, I became a problem. The first time he suggested I slow down my research was framed as concern. "You're running yourself into the ground," he said. "You don't have to work this hard. We have enough." I explained that it was not about having enough, that it had never been about having enough, that there was a protocol I was trying to build and a disease I was trying to cure, and that the work had a purpose that was not reducible to financial necessity. He nodded. He said he understood. Then, 2 months later, his mother mentioned, in the specific way Eleanor mentioned things that she intended to land as suggestions but functioned as instructions, that it looked unusual for a Hayes wife to be working laboratory hours when her husband was building his business. She said it reflected a lack of support that people noticed. She said it sent a message about the marriage that she was not certain Christopher deserved. Christopher did not challenge this. He let it sit in the air between us at the dinner table, and the following week he brought it up again himself, phrased differently, as a question about our priorities and what we were building together, and whether I had considered how the laboratory hours were affecting our ability to be present in each other's lives. I reduced my hours. I told myself it was temporary. It was not temporary. It was the first concession in a series of concessions that were each individually reasonable and collectively constituted the dismantling of the person I had been before I said yes to the Hayes family's understanding of what a wife was supposed to be. Over the next 3 years, I stopped going into the university laboratory. I moved my work entirely into the home basement. I attended Eleanor's events and Christopher's events and reduced my public professional identity to a footnote. I did not stop the research. I simply made it invisible. And Christopher, satisfied that the visible version of me matched the version Eleanor had described as appropriate, stopped paying attention to what I was actually doing. I am not angry about this anymore. I was, for a long time, and the anger was justified. But what I feel now, looking back at those years, is something more complex than anger, a kind of complicated gratitude for the specific circumstance that gave me, without intending to, the most valuable professional resource I ever had. Unmonitored time, complete operational freedom in a fully equipped laboratory that Christopher had funded and forgotten. The protocol that became the billion-dollar licensing deal was developed in that basement over 4 years of work that Christopher dismissed as a hobby, mocked in front of his friends, and never once examined closely enough to understand. He was too comfortable to look, and I was too focused on the work to remind him to. I found out I was pregnant in June of the year this story arrives at its crisis. I was 36 years old, and the pregnancy was not precisely planned, but was not unexpected. Christopher and I had talked about children in the abstract way that couples talk about things they mean to address when the conditions are right. And I had reduced my birth control dosage earlier that year as part of a conversation we had had about the timing being less wrong than it had been before. I made his favorite meal the night I told him the jerk chicken his grandmother's housekeeper had made for him every Sunday as a child, and that he had taught me to make in our first year of marriage. I waited until after dinner, and I showed him the test. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he pulled me into his arms and said, "We're going to be parents." And I believed him. The warmth in that moment felt real. Looking back, I understand that it probably was real. Christopher's ability to feel warmth and his ability to act on the basis of long-term calculation were not mutually exclusive. He could feel the warmth and simultaneously be doing something else entirely with another part of himself. But that night, in the kitchen, with the chicken still warm on the stovetop and the pregnancy test in his hand, he held me and seemed happy, and I was happy, and the work was progressing, and the protocol was in its final stages, and I did not know what he was doing with Natalie Prescott, or how long it had been going on, or what she had told him about. What came next? Natalie Prescott was 28 years old, a junior partner at a real estate investment firm that Christopher had been working with for 8 months. She was accomplished in the narrow and specific way that Christopher valued accomplishment in women successful enough to be impressive, positioned in a field adjacent to his rather than competitive with it, ambitious in ways that supported his vision rather than existing independently of it. I had met her twice. At a company dinner in August, where Christopher had introduced her as an invaluable member of the team, and she had shaken my hand with a specific warmth of someone who is performing courtesy and doing it competently. And at a charity event in October, where I had noticed, without yet having the context to correctly interpret what I was noticing, that the way Christopher spoke to Natalie was the way he had spoken to me in the first 2 years of our relationship, with the full attention that made people feel seen. I mentioned it to him afterward. He told me I was projecting. He said I had always had a tendency toward insecurity that he had hoped the pregnancy would settle. I wrote it in my journal. I added it to a list that had been building for years of things Christopher had told me were my perceptions rather than facts. The list was long by then. I had stopped arguing with each individual item. I had started keeping the list instead. The morning the twins were born was a Monday in November. I had been having contractions since 4 a.m., and Christopher had driven me to the hospital with the detached efficiency of a man who was managing a logistical situation rather than participating in an experience. He sat in the labor room with his phone in his hand and left twice to take calls in the corridor. I did not say anything about the phone or the calls. I was focused on the contractions and on the protocol, which had reached a stage I had been anticipating for 6 months, the final licensing negotiation with a pharmaceutical company whose research team had reviewed my work and had been in discussion with my attorney for 11 weeks about the terms of a partnership that would take the gene editing protocol from my basement laboratory into the clinical trial phase that would. Eventually, I believe this with the certainty of someone who has spent 8 years building toward a thing and has arrived at the evidence that it will work to make the disease that killed Marcus Hayes in a Detroit hospital on a November morning no longer capable of killing anyone. The negotiation had reached its final stage in the previous week. My attorney, a woman named Dr. Amara Nwasu, who had been handling the intellectual property dimensions of Mitchell Biosolutions for 4 years, had told me Thursday that we were within days of execution. She had told me to keep my phone on. At 8:47 in the morning, as I was being wheeled into the operating room, the twins had shifted into a position that required a cesarean, and the doctors were moving quickly. My phone buzzed. I looked at the screen. The email was from Amara. Subject line: executed. The body of the email was 2 sentences. The agreement is signed. $1.2 billion. I turned my phone face down on my stomach and let them wheel me through the operating room doors. The last thing I saw before the curtain went up was Christopher in the corridor outside, on his phone, not watching. At 9:41 a.m., Micah and Asha were born, 1 minute apart, both crying with the specific conviction of people who have just arrived somewhere completely new and are not yet certain they endorse it. They placed Micah on my chest, and the weight of him was the most specific thing I had ever felt in my life. Not abstract, not symbolic, entirely and completely real, a particular weight that was his and nobody else's. They placed Asha beside him, and she turned her face toward me with the instinctive turning of someone who already knows which direction warmth comes from. I held them both, and the $1 billion and the prenup and Christopher and Natalie and 8 years of everything were, for approximately 20 minutes, simply noise in a room that contained my children and me, and the most important thing that had ever happened in my life. Then Christopher walked through the door. He was wearing the gray suit I had watched him choose that morning from our closet, the $4,000 one he reserved for presentations he wanted to go well. He was not alone. Natalie Prescott stood behind him in a cream silk blouse and a skirt that was business formal, and she had clearly dressed with intention, because that was not office clothing, and this was not her office. Christopher carried an envelope in his hand. He did not look at the twins when he entered. He looked at me, and he placed the envelope on the rolling tray beside my bed, beside the cup of ice chips the nurse had brought me, beside the consent form I had signed at 4 a.m. when they told me we needed to move to a cesarean immediately, and he said, "We are done. I need you to sign these." I want to tell you what it feels like to hear those words when you have surgical staples holding your abdomen together, and your babies are 15 minutes old, and your hands are shaking from the after effects of anesthesia. I want to be accurate about this because the accuracy matters. It does not feel the way betrayal is supposed to feel in the versions of this story that are told for drama. It does not feel like a knife. It does not feel like falling. It feels, at first, like the specific wrong note that your brain cannot process correctly, like a sentence that is grammatically complete but semantically impossible. A sentence that sounds like a language you know, but means something you cannot locate in any frame of reference you have built for your life. I looked at the envelope. I looked at Christopher. I looked at Natalie in the doorway in her cream silk blouse. And then I looked at Micah and Asha, both of them on my chest. And I felt something settle in me that was not calm exactly, but was something related to calm, the specific internal stillness that arrives when a person has arrived at a point beyond which they will not be moved, not because nothing is happening, but because everything that happens from this point forward will happen to a version of themselves they have already decided about. The nurse in the room had gone completely still. Her hand was on the blood pressure monitor, and she had stopped moving it. Christopher did not look at her. He did not look at the twins. He said, "I know the timing is unfortunate, but I need this handled today. My attorney already filed. This is a formality." I looked at him, and I said, quietly, "Christopher, who is she?" He did not answer. Natalie answered. She said, "I think you know who I am." I said, "I know who you are. I am asking why she is here." Christopher said, "Because this involves her." I said, "She is not my family. She is not the mother of these children. She is not named on any document in this hospital. She should not be in this room." Christopher said, "Sierra." He used my middle name, the name he had always used when he was trying to manage me. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. The papers are fair." My attorney made sure of that. I said, "Your attorney?" He said, "Yes." I said, "The one you hired 6 months ago." He said, "What?" I said, "The filing is from 6 months ago, Christopher. The date is right here on the envelope. He had filed 6 months ago, when I was newly pregnant, when he had pulled me into his arms in the kitchen and said, 'We're going to be parents.' He had already hired the attorney. He had already been planning this. The warmth in the kitchen had been real, and he had been planning to leave me, and both things had been true simultaneously, and the specific horror of that, not the leaving, the simultaneous truth of both was the thing that landed most heavily. I did not sign the papers. I held my twins, and I did not sign. And Christopher stood at the foot of my hospital bed for 11 minutes, trying to convince me. And then Natalie touched his arm and said something quietly. And he looked at his watch, and he said, 48 hours. You have 48 hours, and then my attorney files a motion, and this gets complicated for you." I said, "It is already complicated." He looked at me for a moment, and I saw something in his face that I recognized. Not guilt, not love, something older than both of those things. Something that was the residue of the man I had married, and the relationship that had existed before it became what it had become. Then it was gone, and he turned, and they left. And the door closed, and the nurse crossed the room and put her hand on my arm and said, "I'm filing an incident report." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Is there someone I can call?" I said, "Yes." And I gave her Dr. Amuranosu's number. The 48 hours between the hospital room and the conference room were the most clarifying hours of my life. Not because things became simple. They were not simple. But because the particular fog of a marriage, in which you have been gradually and consistently told that your perceptions are wrong, lifted completely in the recovery room. The moment Christopher placed that envelope on my tray, and what was left after the fog lifted was not devastation, but vision. I could see everything clearly. I could see the 8 years with a specific accuracy of someone who has been looking at something from too close and has stepped back to the distance where it resolves. I could see the basement laboratory and the 4 years of work conducted in the hours Christopher was asleep or traveling or managing his investors. I could see the protocol in the email from Amara and the number in the subject line. I could see the prenup and the clause that Dr. Patricia Oduya had insisted on in a conversation 11 years earlier when I was 26 years old and she was 63, and she had been married twice, and she said, "Simone, you are going to build something important. Do not let anyone be in a position to take it from you when the important thing arrives." I had listened to her. I had kept the clause, and Christopher had signed the document without reading past the page that protected his own assets, because he had never imagined he would need to read further than that, because he had never seriously considered that I might have assets of my own worth protecting. I called Amara from the recovery room. She answered on the first ring. I told her what had happened. There was a silence on the other end of the line that lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then she said, "The timing of the filing, has that been confirmed?" I told her yes. She said, "The deal executed at 8:47. The filing timestamp?" I looked at the documentation on the envelope. 3:52 p.m. She said, "That is 6 hours and 14 minutes after the 60-day clause began running." I said, "Yes." She said, "Simone, I need you to understand what I am about to tell you. He has just triggered the penalty provision." "I already know," I said. She was quiet for another moment. She said, "Are you all right?" I said, "I have my babies. I have the clause. I am all right." She said, "I will be in Chicago tomorrow morning. We will be ready for whatever comes next." I thanked her and ended the call and looked at Micah and Aisha, both sleeping now, both making the specific small sounds of new people acclimating to a world that had more air in it than they were used to. I kissed each of their foreheads. I said to them what I had been saying to Marcus in my head for 8 years, when the work was hard and the results were uncertain, and the reason for continuing needed to be remembered. I said, "This is for you." The conference room was on the 42nd floor of a building in downtown Chicago that I had passed hundreds of times, without ever imagining I would be sitting in it 3 days after major surgery wearing a navy dress that I had bought the previous year for a professional event that Christopher had been too busy to attend. The twins were with my mother in the waiting room outside my mother, who had driven from Detroit the morning after I called her from the hospital, who had arrived in my recovery room with the particular efficiency of a woman who has spent her life solving problems rather than performing feelings about them, who had looked at me in the hospital bed and said, "What do you need?" and had meant it as a logistical question. My mother, Constance Hayes, who had raised Marcus and me alone after our father left when I was 7, who had worked double shifts at the hospital where Marcus died, and who had kissed my forehead in that same hospital on the morning I left for university, and said, "Go fix it." I had spent 20 years trying. Across the conference table sat Christopher and his attorney, a man named William Ford, who had a reputation in Chicago legal circles for being effective in precisely the way that a very expensive instrument is effective precisely calibrated and entirely without warmth. Beside Christopher sat Natalie, who had apparently decided she was a participant in divorce proceedings rather than a person who had been asked to wait in the corridor. Beside me sat Amara Nwosu, and a specialist she had brought in, a woman named Catherine Osei Bongsu, who had flown from London, who had spent 20 years in intellectual property litigation, and who had the specific stillness of someone who has walked into rooms like this many times and found them less frightening than the people in them expected. Catherine had a thin stack of documents in front of her. William Ford had a much thicker stack. The difference in stack thickness told its own story about who had spent the preceding 48 hours working and who had spent them assuming. William Ford opened by stating his client's settlement offer, $850,000. Full custody of the twins, with Christopher retaining visitation rights. Child support calculated on Christopher's current reported income. In exchange, I would waive all claims to marital property, business assets, and future earnings. He said it with the practiced confidence of a man who has made this kind of offer before and watched it accepted. Christopher leaned back in his chair with the expression of a man waiting for a signature. Natalie kept her eyes on the table. Catherine Osei-Bongsu waited until William Ford had finished speaking. Then she said, "Mrs. Hayes will not be accepting that offer. She will not be accepting any offer. Because your client has already triggered the penalty provision of the prenuptial agreement he signed in 2015, and the consequences of that are not subject to negotiation. They are contractual." William Ford said, "What prenuptial agreement?" Catherine placed the document on the table, signed by both parties in the 14th of August, 2015. Witnessed, notarized, fully compliant with Illinois law. Christopher's attorney pulled it toward him and began reading. Christopher reached for his water glass. His hand was not entirely steady. "There's nothing in that prenup that protects her," Christopher said, his voice carrying the specific dismissive certainty of a man who's operating from the assumption that he wrote the terms. She came into this marriage with nothing. She had a doctorate and student loans. There was nothing to protect. Catherine opened the document to page 7. Section 12, subsection C, she said. Any intellectual property developed by either party during the marriage remains the sole property of its creator. She paused and let him read it. And Section 14, she continued, the penalty clause. If either party files for divorce within 60 days of the other party executing a major financial transaction defined as any contract exceeding $100 million in value, the filing party forfeits 40% of their net personal worth as liquidated damages. William Ford had gone completely pale. He was reading with the focused intensity of a man watching the case he had prepared disassemble itself in real time. Christopher said, "Sierra doesn't have a financial transaction. She doesn't have anything. She lives in my house. She uses my accounts. She does research in my basement." Catherine said, "She does research in the laboratory in your basement. Yes, but the research belongs to her." She slid the second document across the table. Mitchell Biosolutions, LLC, a Delaware limited liability company, established in 2013, 2 years before your marriage, wholly owned by Dr. Simone Mitchell Hayes. Christopher stared at the document. The color was leaving his face in a visible and measurable way. A Delaware LLC, her own company. I didn't know about any company. That's correct, Catherine said. You didn't know, because you stopped paying attention to what she was doing. You stopped asking. You assumed there was nothing to know. She placed the third document on the table. On the morning of November 18th, At 8:47 a.m., Dr. Hayes executed a licensing agreement with Vertex Biopharmaceuticals. The agreement licenses her gene editing protocol for the treatment of sickle cell disease. The contract value is $1.2 billion. The upfront payment was $400 million. The royalty structure generates substantial ongoing income for the next 22 years. Christopher's attorney stopped reading the prenup. He was very still. Natalie, beside Christopher, was very still. The air conditioning hummed through the vents, and nothing else made a sound for approximately 4 seconds. Your client filed for divorce, Catherine continued, at 3:52 p.m. on November 18th. That is 6 hours and 14 minutes after the 60-day penalty period began, which means your client has triggered Section 14 of the prenuptial agreement. His personal net worth has been independently assessed. Real estate holdings, investment portfolios, business interests, the art collection, the vehicles, everything. The current figure is $43 million. 40% of that is $17.2 million. Christopher said, "This is impossible. She doesn't have $1 billion. She was in surgery." "She was in surgery," Catherine said, but her attorney was not. The agreement executed at 8:47. The notification was delivered to your wife's phone while she was being prepared for the operating room. She did not sign the papers in the hospital room, and the 60-day clock continued running from the moment the contract executed. The timeline is documented, time-stamped, and legally unassailable. Christopher pushed back from the table. "This is a setup. You planned this. I planned nothing, except the work," I said. It was the first time I had spoken since sitting down. Christopher turned to look at me. "You planned nothing?" His voice was almost confused, like he was trying to find the trap and could not locate it. I said, "I planned the research. I planned the protocol. I spent 8 years in the laboratory you called a hobby room, building a treatment for the disease that killed my brother in 1993, in a hospital 20 minutes from the house where you grew up, while your mother told me I was embarrassing you by continuing to work. I spent 8 years developing intellectual property that your prenuptial agreement explicitly protects, because you signed a document that you never read past the page that protected your own interests." He stared at me. I stared back. I want to be accurate about what I felt in that moment, because the dramatic version would be triumph, and the true version is more complicated than that. What I felt was the specific, quiet satisfaction of someone who has spent a long time doing work that was dismissed and has watched that work arrive at its confirmation, not vindication, confirmation. The work was always real. The protocol was always going to work. Marcus had always deserved for it to work. Christopher, not believing in it, had not made it less real. It had simply made his dismissal available to be corrected by the record. William Ford asked for 10 minutes to confer with his client privately. Catherine gave them 15. When they returned, Christopher's attorney began to speak about challenging the prenup on grounds of unconscionability. Catherine let him finish. Then, she explained, in the specific detailed language of someone who has done this before, why that challenge would fail. Both parties had signed voluntarily. Both had been advised to seek independent counsel. Christopher had publicly described the prenup as the smartest thing he had ever signed at his own rehearsal dinner in front of 23 witnesses, some of whom were still friends with both of us and would testify to that. Description: under oath. She explained that we had documentation of everything that had occurred in the hospital recovery room on November 18th, that the nurse had filed an incident report within the hour, that the medical records established Christopher's presence in the room with precision, that serving divorce papers to a patient within 15 minutes of major surgery, while that patient was still bleeding from the incision, with a third party present who had no legal standing to be there, was something a judge was going to view with the specific, unfavorable lens that courts reserve for conduct that is not merely legally questionable, but humanly indefensible. I looked at Natalie while Catherine was speaking. She was looking at Christopher. The expression on her face was one I had seen before, not on her face, but on my own, years ago, when I first began to understand that the man I had married had a quality in him that was capable of this kind of calculation. It was the expression of a woman who is revising an assessment in real time and does not like what the revision is producing. Christopher felt her looking at him. He turned to her. She looked away. It was a small thing, but I understood what it meant. Catherine placed the final document on the table. Dr. Hayes' counter-proposal. Christopher could accept the prenup penalty as contractually required $17.2 million payable within 90 days, and the divorce would proceed on agreed terms, including full legal custody of the twins and a child support figure calculated on his full verified income. Or he could contest it in court, which would trigger full financial disclosure in public proceedings, which would mean that every investor, every business partner, every member of the Hayes family social circle would have access to the time-stamped record of a man who had served his wife divorce papers 15 minutes after she gave birth to their children in a hospital recovery room while she was still bleeding from surgery, with his girlfriend standing in the doorway in ivory silk. Catherine said this in the specific, calm way of someone who does not need to raise their voice to make a point land. The point landed. Christopher's attorney looked at his client for a long moment. Christopher stared at the table. When he finally looked up, he did not look at me. He looked at Natalie. She met his eyes, and then she looked away again. He accepted the settlement. $17.2 million, payable within 90 days. Full legal custody of Micah and Aisha. Child support calculated on verified income, not reported income, which was a distinction his attorney tried to negotiate out of and did not succeed in negotiating out of. It took 4 hours to reach the final signatures. When we were done, I stood up, gathered my bag, and walked to the door. I stopped. I turned back. Christopher was still in his chair, his attorney beside him reviewing the signed documents. Natalie had already left. She had excused herself 40 minutes earlier and had not returned. I looked at Christopher, and I thought about the man I had met at the medical conference in Boston when I was 29, and he was 41, and the specific quality of the attention he had paid me that had made me feel seen in a way I had not been prepared for. I thought about 8 years. I thought about the kitchen and the jerk chicken and the pregnancy test and the warmth that had been real and the filing that had been happening simultaneously. I thought about Marcus. I said, I am going to name the foundation after my brother. We are going to fund sickle cell research and provide financial support to affected families. The protocol is in clinical trials. We believe we will have results within 3 years. Christopher did not say anything. I looked at him for another moment. Then I went out to the waiting room where my mother was sitting with Micah and Asha, both awake and looking at the world with the dark, curious eyes of people who have very recently arrived in it and are taking inventory. I picked them up, one in each arm, and felt their weight and their warmth and the absolute trust of small people who have not yet learned that trust requires evidence. My mother looked at me. Well, she said. I said, it's done. She nodded once, the way she nodded when something that needed to be done had been done. She said, your brother would have liked them. I said, I know. She said, let's go home. 6 weeks after the conference room, Christopher paid the settlement in full. His real estate company absorbed a significant impact when the circumstances of the divorce, the hospital room, the timing, the prenup became known in Chicago business circles through the ordinary mechanisms by which information travels in a city where everyone who matters knows everyone else. I did not release the story publicly. I did not need to. William Ford's assistant had told someone in his office, and the someone in his office had told someone who went to the same golf club as 3 of Christopher's primary investors. And by the time a month had passed, the story had. The specific viral quality of something that people feel compelled to share because it confirms something they had already suspected about the person it describes. Natalie Prescott left Chicago in January. She had taken a position at a firm in New York, and whatever arrangement she and Christopher had been building together in the months before the divorce did not survive the conference room. Christopher had a phone call with me in February, in his attorney's office, civil and businesslike, about the specifics of visitation with the twins. He was attentive to them. Whatever he had felt or not felt in the hospital room, he was attentive to Micah and Aisha in the ways that mattered, and I was grateful for that, and said so. It did not change what had happened, but it was something. I bought a house in Oak Park. I built a real laboratory in the basement, not a converted storage room, but a purpose-built research facility with the equipment the work required. I hired 2 research associates. I continued building toward the second protocol, which addressed a related genetic mechanism, and which I expected to have in clinical-ready form within 4 years. I established the Marcus Hayes Foundation with an initial endowment of $40 million. We funded 6 research partnerships in the first year. We provided financial assistance to 62 families affected by sickle cell disease in the first year. We had a website with a photograph of Marcus at 9 years old, the one where he is laughing so hard at something off camera that his whole face is involved in it. The one where you can see exactly what his laugh looked like from the next block over. I put Micah and Aisha to bed every night and kissed each of them on the forehead and talked to them about Marcus, about the nightlight and the laugh and the Detroit kitchen and the way he had of making everything feel like it was going to be fine, even when it was not going to be fine. Because he was 11 years old, and 11-year-olds believe in the future with a completeness that adults have mostly learned out of. I told them they were loved and safe, and that they were never going to have to make themselves smaller for anyone. And I meant it with the specific conviction of someone who had spent 20 years finding out what the cost of making yourself smaller was, and had paid it, and was done paying. I want to close with something, Doctor. Patricia Oduya said to me in her laboratory at Northwestern when I was 26 years old and newly engaged, and she was helping me draft the intellectual property clause for the prenuptial agreement I was about to ask Christopher to sign. She said, "Simone, the people who love you and the people who try to use you are not always different people. Sometimes they are the same person at different points in the same relationship. This does not make the love retroactively false. It makes it complicated, and complicated things require careful structures to protect them. Build the structure. Always build the structure." She died 3 years before the protocol was executed. She did not see the licensing agreement or the conference room, or the foundation named for my brother. But the structure she helped me build was in every document that mattered on November 18th, and every document that mattered in the 42nd floor conference room 6 weeks later. She built part of what protected me. I am trying to do the same thing for the next person who needs it built. The foundation is part of that. This story is part of that. The reason I am telling it is not revenge and not catharsis and not the particular satisfaction of a public record that sets something straight, though all of those things are present. The reason is the one my mentor would have recognized. Because somewhere, right now, a woman who is intelligent and capable and has spent years making herself smaller for someone else's comfort is doing the work in the dark without knowing whether it will come to anything. And she needs to know that the work comes to something, that the cause matters, that the structure built quietly in the years when no one was watching is the structure that holds when everything else falls away. Build the structure, protect your work, and trust that the record, the actual record, the time-stamped, documented, verifiable record is always on the side of the person who has been telling the truth. Before I finish, drop your city in the comments. Tell me where you are watching from, and tell me this. When Dr. Oduya told a 26-year-old newly engaged woman to build a structure to protect herself from the people who loved her, do you think she was being cynical, or do you think she was being the most honest thing that a mentor can be? I want your answer. Subscribe if you have not already, and come back next week, because we are bringing you the story of a woman who spent 11 years as the silent operational partner of a company her husband founded, and whose name appeared nowhere in the process. Corporate documents who discovered this fact on the morning she received a call from his attorney informing her that the company had just been sold for $60 million and she was not listed as a stakeholder. What she did in the 24 hours after that phone call is the kind of story that requires you to watch from the beginning to understand the ending. That story goes live next week. Come back, ready for it.